I'm going to be reading a story from my new collection, Omicron Ceti 3, available for sale tomorrow, I guess, or you can buy it tonight on Amazon. But actually, I'm going to read this story from a sort of an abridged, slightly abridged, and slightly more PG-13 version that was as it was originally published. It's called My Secret War, and this was actually the original title for my collection, but then it got reworked. And a couple things. My reading may go on a little bit longer than normally I read here because I'm going to read a whole story, and they're giving me a little extra time tonight because of my book. And so hopefully it'll be like, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes, but I don't know, we might be here till, when do we have to be out of this room? No, we'll see. And what else? I think that's it. So, yeah, I've never read this. I've read this once in public, and that was actually at my job interview here at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. And so I always think that they either hired me because of this story or in spite of it. And I'll let you decide. It's called My Secret War. The rumor was that Dr. Pierce had been in the FBI, maybe still was. It was hard to believe. Looking at him from behind my desk in honors English at Middleton Prep, I couldn't square him with any of the associations I had with that organization: J. Edgar Hoover, the Untouchables, wiretapping for Nixon. As far as I could tell, he was just a fussy, middle-aged English teacher, a well-preserved holdover from an earlier age. He wore faded but well-tailored suits with bow ties, wire-rimmed glasses, and a salt and pepper mustache as thick as a fuller brush. His hair was short on the sides, long on top, with a cowlick that curled over his forehead, and a slight sheen from what was undoubtedly Vitalis or some other 1950s brand of hair tonic. Had he been younger, that hairstyle might have been taken for the rockabilly look that was soon to reemerge, almost hip. But at his age, in 1979, it just meant he hadn't changed his hairstyle since Eisenhower was president. But if he seemed to be the kind of guy who would get sand kicked in his face at the beach, if you could ever imagine Dr. Pierce at the beach with his pale white skin and bow tie, he nonetheless had a reputation as a ruthlessly tough teacher. Angie, my best friend, didn't even go to Middleton, and she had heard of him. "Oh, you've got Pierce," she said. "You better be careful. I heard he had a kid expelled for using the Monarch notes in his class, and they say he's got weird government connections." I should have listened to Angie. It might have saved me a lot of trouble. I might have been more cautious in my efforts to destroy him. Dr. Pierce believed in strict form and procedure. One of the first things he did with our class was to teach us how to keep a proper English notebook. Separate sections for class notes, homework, quizzes, tests, and handouts. Everything had to be kept in a prescribed order, separated by tabbed dividers and set in an expansion binder, the kind with the flat metal rod running along the inside. He was a man devoted to compartmentalization. Then there were the dread grammar rules he made us memorize as if they were the 10 Commandments. Every Friday we were quizzed on one. They had to be rewritten precisely. If you changed a word or left out a comma, you lost a point. And though I never got 100% on any of those quizzes, to this day I still remember a pronoun must agree in number and sex with its antecedent. And of course, there was class etiquette. You didn't talk without raising your hand in Dr. Pierce's class. You didn't move from your assigned seat or misalign the rows of desks or bring food into the classroom. If you did, you'd regret it. If he was in the FBI, I once thought, he must have been in charge of making sure the agents straightened their ties and shined their shoes. There was, however, an air of mystery about him. He would make frequent references to world travel, to Paris after the war, or Saigon in the 1950s. They say he never had to wait in line for gas during the oil crisis, and when the Shah came to New York for heart surgery shortly before the Iranian hostage crisis, Dr. Pierce talked about him as though they were personal friends. He had a heavy hand, no doubt, Dr. Pierce told our class, but he modernized that country, and it's hard to hate a man who knows 365 ways to cook an eggplant. That he kept his private life private, however, served as the most convincing evidence Dr. Pierce was some kind of secret agent. Whether for teachers or students, seclusion at Middleton was neither easy nor encouraged. I was a day commuter, so I didn't live in the dorms, but I knew Dr. Pierce had an apartment on campus, and from what I understood, no student had ever stepped foot inside his quarters. Even the other teachers didn't socialize with him. Though he ate lunch at the cafeteria along with the other faculty, he always took his dinners alone, and often at night he would be seen driving off in his pine green Dodge Dart to destinations unknown. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the rumors. I had overwhelming concerns of my own. It was my senior year, and I was caught up in a web of secrecy, self-loathing, and alienation that I had begun to weave more than 2 years earlier. I was leading a double life, one that had, in fact, gotten me pulled out of public school and sent to Middleton in the first place. It began of all places at Camp Brigadoon, the sleepaway camp I attended every summer. When I was 15 and had finally become a full-fledged counselor there, I, along with many of my peers, started drinking and smoking pot for the first time. But my true initiation occurred at the end of the season when I kissed another guy, Doug Hampton, a fellow counselor, after a late night of partying by the campfire, doing bong hits and swigging Everclear and OJ. It wasn't exactly my first sexual experience. I had kissed a couple of girls that summer, and the previous year at camp, I had platonically dated one of the other leaders in training. More to the point, for several years prior to that, I had been borrowing my older brother's pornographic magazines and spending hours with them in the bathroom. But it wasn't until that night that I realized why I hadn't met the right girl and why I had been increasingly drawn to the more hardcore publications. The ones that featured men and women together. It wasn't because the sex was more explicit. It was because the men were more visible, those strong naked men. An increasing sense of shame had accompanied those long retreats in the bathroom, and now I finally knew why. And though kissing Doug felt good while my sense of guilt and mortification was anesthetized by pot and grain alcohol, I didn't welcome such realizations the next day when I was sober, and I snubbed Doug at the cafeteria and avoided him for what was left of the summer. When I got back home, the first thing I did was call Angie, and the two of us started hanging out again. I made as though my big discovery at camp was getting high, and we started partying on a regular basis, at first buying from local dealers, and then, later, when Angie got her license, driving down to Poughkeepsie to score nickel and dime bags. By the time school started, I had developed a pot habit that far exceeded the dabbling I did at Brigadoon. I had also vowed never again to masturbate or think about sex. But that never worked for very long. I might be okay for a week or two, but then I would weaken and resort to the magazines under my brother's bed. And when I got my driver's license, I found myself heading out of town to purchase my own porno, without fear of being spotted by friends or family. That's when I turned from playboy to playgirl, from hustler to honcho. But I didn't feel good about it. When I'd return home and relieve myself of the sexual urge that had driven me 20 miles across Dutchess County, I'd wrap my new purchases in several bags, dispose of them in the bottom of the garbage can in the garage, and head for my stash to burn my guilt away in a haze of marijuana smoke. More than once, I dug out those magazines from underneath coffee grinds and chicken bones to reuse them before the garbage was collected. Dr. Pierce's area of specialty was the American Renaissance: Emerson, Thoreau, Dickinson, Whitman, Melville, and Hawthorne. And when he spoke of those authors, his eyes brightened behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, and I could swear his cowlick started to uncurl. I still can't figure out how the self-same man who docked me 10 points every term for not using an expansion binder could quote those great visionaries with such passion. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. He read one day at the start of class, quoting from Emerson's Self-Reliance. No law can be sacred to me but that of my own nature. His voice, usually tinny and irritating, resonated that morning with a tender and empathic wisdom, and he seemed transformed from the comical little Don into the great poet whose words vibrated to the iron string of life itself. Do you believe that, he asked us? Do you believe that what is true for you in your innermost heart is true for all men? He allowed the class to sit silently for a few moments, and I looked inside myself and I pondered my private heart, and then I raised my hand and Dr. Pierce called on me. I don't believe it, I said. Some men's souls are corrupt. They're sick or evil. Well, Dr. Pierce said, Emerson admits that some men, he refers to the bold sensualist, would use philosophy to excuse their crimes, but he says they have not confronted their own conscience. Our conscience, our inner law, he says, is our toughest taskmaster. Cindy Bingham then raised her hand. I don't see how that can be true, she said. If everyone just obeyed their own heart, there'd be total chaos. We need laws, we need rules to keep our society together. And then others piped in, citing Son of Sam and Charles Manson. And for the rest of class, we found ourselves arguing against Dr. Pierce in favor of conformity and the importance of social control. When I got home that day, I wondered what kind of game he was playing. How had he managed to turn the tables? I felt at times as though he were speaking only to me, as if he knew the bold sensualist I had become. And that's when I began to wonder what was in Dr. Pierce's private heart, and when I first felt the stirrings of a deep antipathy toward him. Around that time, my depravity reached new heights, or new lows, depending on how one calculates such things. My strange, compulsive longings pushed me further and further, and I often found myself driving aimlessly about, searching for something I could not or would not name. And then one Saturday night outside Poughkeepsie, I passed a bar that had no windows. A few men loitered in front. 2 were holding hands. The place was just off the highway, part of a run-down strip mall whose stores all closed by 6 p.m. It was called aptly the Hideaway. I slowed the car down as I went by, but when one of the men caught my eye, I sped up again and went straight home to masturbate and get high. The next night, however, I returned. I drove around to the rear of the bar where the entrance was and parked the car and watched the men go in. They weren't like me, I thought. They were dressed in designer jeans and leather shoes and sported impeccably coiffed hair. While there I was with my tangled, overgrown tresses, soiled Levi's, and a concert t-shirt from an ELO show I had gone to with Angie. These guys were gay. I was just a sexual deviant, which in some way made me feel superior. I'd cure myself one of these days, or at least keep it separate from the rest of my life. They had made a culture of it. And then I saw something that hit me as hard as that orange juice container full of Everclear by the campfire nearly 2 years earlier. Ahead of me to the right, 2 men were in the front seat of a car, their heads rotating side to side, 2 synchronized gyroscopes in slow motion as they pressed their lips together, sometimes drawing back slightly so that I could almost see their brawling tongues. And then one of those heads, the one belonging to the man on the passenger side, began to descend as the other leaned back against the driver's side window. And when only one man was visible, I saw that the driver wore wire-rimmed glasses, and there was a cowlick hanging over his forehead, and though he wasn't wearing a bow tie, he was driving a green Dodge Dart. The next day, I fired up a joint during lunch hour at school. I'd been pretty good up until then about not partying until the evening, but I couldn't face Dr. Pierce straight after what I'd seen. My war with him, however, did not commence until a few weeks later when we began the Scarlet Letter. That's when I took up my role as the not-so-loyal opposition, initiating battle with an act of civil disobedience which, like the war itself, was doomed to fail. Dr. Pierce had read aloud the novel's short second chapter, The Prison Door. transfixing the rest of the class with his sonorous tones, but I was now immune to such tricks. "What do you think the rose outside the prison door symbolizes?" he asked. "How do we know it symbolizes anything?" I called out. "Raise your hand when you have a response, Mr. Jackson." How do we know it symbolizes anything? Well, Mr. Jackson, to start with, it is a general rule of literary studies that any time an author calls attention to a delicate flower growing outside a place of bondage and sorrow, it is safe to assume that it represents something other than a botanical anomaly. Secondly, if you will direct your attention to the last sentence of the last paragraph, you will recall the narrator explicitly says of the rose, and here he stopped and picked up the book to read, though I'm quite sure he could have quoted it by heart. "It may serve to symbolize some sweet moral blossom." So, let me rephrase the question. What sort of sweet moral blossom might this rose symbolize? How can we know before we've read the book? Mr. Jackson, have you injured your arm? That is the second time you have called out a response. This is not a Baptist church. If you would like to participate, I expect you to follow protocol. Protocol. Just the kind of word I would expect from a pervert posing as an FBI agent, posing as an English teacher. Cindy raised her hand. "It symbolizes hope." "Good," he said, "but why a rose? Why not a carnation or a lilac or an orchid?" "Because roses have thorns," I said. "Did you say something, Mr. Jackson?" I raised my hand. "Mr. Jackson, because roses have thorns." "Good. And what might that foreshadow for us?" "Pain." "What else? What color are roses generally?" "Red." "And what does red typically symbolize?" "Love." "Very good, Mr. Jackson. If we can just get that arm mended, we might make a literary scholar out of you yet." I kept my mouth shut for the rest of class while everyone else went on for 20 minutes about that damned rose, the contrast of its color to the gray and black of the pilgrims, the similarity between its thorns and the spikes of the prison door, the long, long history of roses in literature. Roses are red, violets are blue. I'm a homo and you are too. Dr. Pierce asked to see me after class. "Mr. Jackson, are you feeling well today?" "Yes, sir." "Because you seem a little tired, not your usual self, which I'm hoping might account for your behavior." Then he paused. "Tell me," he said, your eyes are a little droopy, a little red, though not quite like a rose. Shall I send you to the nurse?" "No," I said, I'm fine." Was he implying I was stoned? I was, of course. Had been for the past 3 weeks since I'd seen him in the parking lot of the Hideaway. "Very well, then," he said. "Let us have an agreement. You will come to my class alert and clear-eyed, unless, of course, you are truly sick, and then you will see the nurse, and you will raise your hand when you have a question or a comment." "What's your part of the deal?" I asked. "My part of the deal," he said, "shall be holding you accountable." Hypocrite, I thought. If you were in the back of the Hideaway, you'd be holding my Johnson. But I nodded agreement and left, and I stuck to our deal. No more getting high before Dr. Pierce's class, and no more open flouting of his rules. From here on in, it would be a strictly covert operation. By the time Dr. Pierce and I had our little conversation, I had been back to the Hideaway nearly half a dozen times. I hadn't seen him there again, but I kept an eye out for him. And though the drinking age was only 18 at the time, and I probably could have passed, I still hadn't gone inside the bar. The idea of stepping across that threshold terrified me. Besides, I had made a discovery. There was plenty of action outside. The third time I drove my car to the parking lot behind the bar, I lit up a joint and settled back to watch the men go in and to look for Dr. Pierce's Dodge Dart. I nearly swallowed the J when I heard a tap on the passenger side door. I was busted. I was going to jail either for being a dope smoker or a queer. But it wasn't a cop. It was just a guy, a curly-headed guy, maybe 10 years older than I was, with a soft copper mustache and gentle brown eyes. I rolled down the window. "Can I join you?" "Sure," I said, not quite knowing what it was he was joining me for. Did he want to get high? Was he also staking the place out? I didn't allow myself to form consciously the most obvious answer. But after he took a hit off my joint and put his hand on my thigh, I stopped wondering. I don't do this very often, I said. Neither do I, he said, and then he moved his hand over my crotch and onto my belt buckle, which he adroitly unfastened. Seconds later, I was in his mouth, pressing my head back against the window behind me in an unconscious parody of my honors English professor. I hated Dr. Pierce, but I loved The Scarlet Letter. Despite my thick-headed opposition to the novel's symbolic gestures, I was entranced by Hawthorne's regal prose and the Puritan settings with its thees and thous, its dark primeval forest, and its hints of the supernatural. The book served as an escape from the dreariness of Middleton and the sordidness of my increasingly frequent nighttime excursions. I had become a regular in the parking lot of the Hideaway. In a short time, I learned it was better to give than to receive, because for as long as I forestalled my own orgasm, I kept at bay the savage thoughts that haunted my own internal wilderness. It was only afterward, at home, having gotten myself off to images of myself in the passenger seat of someone else's car, taking him into my mouth, tasting him in my throat, that I would be overwhelmed by a kind of postcoital self-loathing. It was only after the release, the explosion of pleasure in the safety of my bathroom, that I would hate myself for what I had done. And then all the Listerine in the world couldn't wash away the film of disgust that coated my throat. And somehow, I began to blame it all on Dr. Pierce. I began to see him as the great moral hypocrite whose corruption had infected me and the rest of the class. Over the next few weeks, I conducted a carefully orchestrated plot to undermine the soul of my English teacher. It was a two-pronged attack consisting of anonymous calling cards meant to drive him into a state of fear and paranoia, and a series of journal entries designed to prick his conscience. I never did anything that might really compromise him. I spread no rumors or innuendo. I left no public markers. Instead, I sent him pictures in the mail culled from Playgirl and Honcho, addressed to his apartment at Middleton, no letter accompanying them. I drew the school's coat of arms on the dust of his trunk when I saw his car parked again behind the Hideaway. Once, in what I thought was a brilliant gesture of sarcasm, I took out subscriptions in his name to various magazines such as Field and Stream, Popular Mechanics, and Sports Illustrated, and mailed him a copy of a book I found at the local Walden's, How to Meet Single Women. Meanwhile, in my journal, which he collected every Friday, I wrote long passages of feigned naivete, meant to inspire in him an inward turn of the soul, so he might see himself for the great hypocrite that he was. I don't understand, I wrote, how Dimmesdale can allow Hester to suffer in solitude, to raise her child alone, to be outcast for a crime that he perpetuated as well. I don't see how such a man, a pillar of the community, a spiritual teacher, can live such a life and face himself in the morning, much less his congregation. What sort of person leads a double life, presenting a countenance of dignity, learning, and honor to his charges, all the while concealing from them his real self, his true nature? What I wonder would Emerson make of him? I think he would have concluded that he was a coward. I thought I was being clever and subtle, and I imagined these words penetrating the heart of Dr. Pierce. He was Saint Sebastian, and my sentences were arrows ripping into his flesh. I envisioned him in his apartment, naked to the waist, scourging himself like Dimmesdale in penance for his sins. I was half convinced that under his jacket and shirt a red and scabrous G would spontaneously emerge from his pale white skin to mock and torture him. But there was no evidence I could discern of any sensitivity to my barbs in his comments. I sympathize with your impatience, he wrote. Dimmesdale's moral cowardice is frustrating, but one can see that he's struggling with his predicament, and I believe Hawthorne wants us to sympathize with him. Emerson would have agreed Dimmesdale is weak, but I think he also would have recognized the strength of the social confines in which he lived, and might have been a little less harsh on the minister than you have been. His comments on my journal entries were always measured and thoughtful. But I didn't read them as carefully as I ought to have. Otherwise, my campaign might have ended earlier than it did. If anything, they pricked me onto bolder measures. I began leaving typed notes in the front drawer of his desk with lines quoted from the Scarlet Letter. I, your pastor, whom you reverence and trust, am utterly a pollution and a lie. And oh, I could reveal a goodly secret. These were not prudent devices, but I was now as driven to such deeds as I had before been compelled to satisfy my secret sexual desires. In fact, at the height of my offensive, I barely thought about sex, only about Dr. Pierce, his hypocrisy, and my determination to undo him. I continued to drive to the hideaway, but now it was only to look for my English teacher's car, and I rejected, with no small sense of moral superiority, the advances of the other parking lot cruisers. But my work was not achieving its goal. I saw no moral distress in Dr. Pierce. He never mentioned the notes left in his desk or on his car or the strange deliveries to his mailbox. He continued to live and teach exactly as he had always done. There must be more to this man, I thought, I concluded, and so one night I decided to trail him. I spent that Friday in my car in the school parking lot with a set of binoculars trained on the windows of his apartment. His blinds were drawn, but the slats were open, and occasionally I saw him wander from the living room to the kitchen, where he poured himself a glass of red wine, then back to the living room again, where he sat down, disappearing from view. At one point, he stood right before the window facing outward, but I didn't get much of a view of him because as soon as he stepped forward, I ducked down and lay across the seat of my car, clutching my binoculars. I remained that way for about 10 minutes before I dared to rise, only to find that he had left the apartment and was walking to his car. I started mine and followed him from a distance, but that didn't prove so easy. When we got onto the main road outside the school, I thought he would head for the interstate towards Poughkeepsie. But instead, he turned into the back streets, winding first through residential neighborhoods and then out to the secondary highway past dairy farms and apple orchards. He drove erratically, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down, and it was all I could do to maintain a discreet distance. I followed him like that for nearly 45 minutes, and though I knew my way around pretty well, I found myself completely lost. Several times, just when I thought I had lost him, his car would be waiting at some lone stoplight ahead, and I would have to veer off onto a side street to avoid pulling up right behind him. And then, through some magic of circumnavigation, he led me back to familiar territory. We were right outside Poughkeepsie, passing the hideaway, but he didn't pull into the parking lot. He kept going. Well, I got stuck at the next traffic light and watched his car disappear over a long, steep hill. On the other side, there was a fork in the road that led either back to the interstate or to another myriad of residential mazes. I chose the mazes, but I couldn't find him. And after a half hour or so of searching, I figured he must have backtracked somehow and returned to the bar. When I got there, however, there was no green Dodge Dart, so I settled back, lit a joint, and pondered my next move. When I heard the familiar tap on the window, I calmly turned to reject yet another parking lot pervert, but there wasn't any rejecting those wire-rimmed eyes of Dr. Pierce. I froze for a moment, caught in the high beams of his eyes, and then looked away, fixing my gaze on the steering wheel, as if somehow it could protect me from whatever humiliation was to come next. My left hand moved mechanically to roll down the driver's side window. "Well, Mr. Jackson," he said, "that was a merry chase. But I think the time for such games is over." I couldn't look at him. Both of my hands were on the steering wheel, and a shudder worked itself from the bottom of my jaw down my neck to my shoulders, arms, and fingers. "You know," he said, "those were some of the routes I used to drive to get here back in the days when I was terrified of being seen, when I thought everyone was watching me. They know, of course, at the school about me. At least the dean does. But he doesn't mind so long as I don't call attention to myself. Dr. Pierce, I'm sorry, was all I could get out. My father used to play that game with me. What if we were being followed? He worked for Hoover, you know, though I don't know exactly what he did. I could see him from the corners of my eyes. He was leaning in toward the window, his hands behind his head, elbows resting on the roof of the car. "You might think a little bit more about your own discretion," he said. "You've developed quite a reputation inside. They call you the parking lot attendant." I started the car. "Wait, Mr. Jackson, we need to talk. Though you're right, this isn't the right place. But I've got something to give you." He reached into his wallet and took out a card and handed it to me. "There are some things an old English professor can teach you and some things he cannot. This is a number for some people who can be of further assistance. I have been pondering ways of delivering it to you, and now here it is. As for you and me, our proper arena is in the classroom and in my office, and I expect to see you in both places Monday afternoon. We will renegotiate the terms of our agreement." "Yes, sir," I managed to get out. "You have been a clever and creative adversary, Mr. Jackson," he said, "but I hope now we can be allies." Then he turned away and walked to the bar, and I watched him as he opened the door and was welcomed into the place where I was not yet ready to go. Thank you.